This lecture is going to talk about World War I. We're going to attempt to cover the whole war. We're not going to go into super detailed pieces of information, just kind of hitting this overview timeline of World War I. Most of us know a lot more about World War II than World War I, so we're going to camp out here for a little bit today. Before we jump into the war, we need to back up a little bit and just sort of lay out the mindset and the political platform that was in place and how we got to even get to a place where we have a world war. And so we're going to back up to the early 19th century, which would have been the 1800s, to this thing called modernism. And modernism originated in German universities. And these theologians began to, now this is a very condensed version of all of these things, but theologians began to sort of exalt their own, which exalt means to raise above, their own reason above God's word. They began to teach the Bible was just a collection of myths, the legends, maybe some historical facts mixed in there. Soon, it didn't take long for there to be a denying of the existence of heaven, of hell, that there is no sin, there is no deity of Christ, and that these teachings of Jesus, that yeah, maybe he was here and they were some great teachings to look at, but really began to quickly spread throughout Germany and through these German universities. And as Americans would go off to these theologian schools, they then brought this mindset back even to America. But this false teachings began to spread and lay some foundation for mindsets to begin to change. And so we have, out of this idea of modernism, Charles Darwin then has a platform to write a book called The Origins of Species. If we have a general mindset that there is no God, there is no higher power, there is no being, then of course it begs the question, where did we all come from? And Charles Darwin was not, he is no, we sort of know him as the father of evolution. The reality is there were several people who were looking at this idea. He just kind of became the first one to publish his book. And like I said, it was in 1859. Darwin proposed that all life on Earth, including man, evolved or came into being by means of this natural process. And this is not a class that's going to dive into that, but it really began to be fought in many arenas. Many people totally, absolutely took a hold of this, and we're actually going to come back to this mindset taught by Charles Darwin. And I think Charles Darwin gets a short end of the stick, because he wasn't the only one looking at this idea of the origins of species. It's just what he was the first one to get it published. But he himself said, if there is no proof within science at some point, then this is just a theory. And of course, then we just several people who don't believe in Darwinism kind of horsewhip him because of this idea that he put into play. But one of the big things is the idea through Darwinism, through evolution, is this idea of survival of the fittest. And that wasn't originated by Charles Darwin. It was another British philosopher who began to do some research into the origins of species. That evolution has these far-reaching effects into religious beliefs, into morality, into economics, into the organization of societies. And one of the big things that we're going to come back to, and I need you to be aware of it, and one of the things about Darwinism is, again, this idea of survival of the fittest, that the weak will perish. And if you look at the animal world, that's sort of how it works. But this idea he brought in, and that there are certain groups of people that are sort of stuck in an evolutionary cycle, and that if you're not at the top of the food chain, if you are not the fittest of the fit, then you are less important, you are less evolved, and therefore you don't carry the same value in in life. And so that idea enables someone like Adolf Hitler to come in and convince you that there's a whole group of people who are not as valuable because they're not the fittest of the fit. And so you do, through this idea of evolution, have this far-reaching effect into morality that we're going to come back to over and over and over. So one of the results from Darwinism is called materialism. And but let me kind of reiterate this, that in a Darwinist mindset, there is no God, there is no higher being, everything is run by chance. And so we've taken God or any sort of higher being out of the equation. And out of that, we have this new mindset called materialism. Materialism is the idea that matter is the only reality. Everything in the world, including our thoughts, our feelings, and our wills, can be explained in terms of matter. Basically, materialism reduces man to a complex machine whose personality is just simply this interrelation of chemical and physical properties. And why this is important is that, from my perspective, as I'm reading through and trying to figure out how someone like, well, eventually Adolf Hitler, but World War I is a catalyst for World War II, and so we have to kind of back up before we get there. These mindsets that begin to devalue humanity. If all we are these chemical and physical properties, then it does not put as much weight in to a person's being and who they are and their identity. So materialism, matter is all that matters. The next step that is taken is this idea of socialism. And socialism is the idea that all economic, all political, and all social life must be planned, controlled, and regulated by the state or by whatever government you're under to ensure, and this is the big quote, the greatest good for the greatest number. Now that idea sounds really great, that we should all be working together, that the greatest good should be there for the greatest number. And I don't know that I necessarily disagree with that in its purest form. The problem is the way that we go about that. Okay. And the problem for me is this idea that the way that we gain the greatest good for the greatest number of people, according to this socialist idea, is that all goods and all services should be redistributed. That from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And again, this idea works perfectly on paper. If we back all the way up to the beginning of U.S. history, and we have a group of people who land at Jamestown. And the idea at Jamestown is that every man would get up every morning and they would do a job. And then they would gather all of their, spoils of the day, and they would split it evenly amongst each other. So if I got up today and collected berries, my neighbor got up today and collected firewood, my other neighbor collected water, that we would then come together and we would evenly distribute what we have done. And that works perfectly on paper. And if humanity was in its nature good and selfless and caring and kind all of the time, it would work. The problem is humanity is not good and kind and selfless all of the time. And so what ends up happening time after time after time after time is it doesn't work. Socialism has yet to be successful, in my opinion, anywhere in all of history. And that probably is a very dramatic statement. Maybe not. There may be a few cases that it has worked. But if I go back through U.S. history and I look at Jamestown, they starved to death. They ate their dogs. They ate their horses. They boiled their boots and they boiled their boot belts to have something to eat. Because man is selfish, and it doesn't work. If I turn on a news channel and I look at several of these countries, Venezuela is one that is falling apart because of socialism. On paper, the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number is a phenomenal mindset, but in reality, and over and over and over, it has proved itself to not work well. Out of socialism, we see more steps going, progressively getting worse, in my opinion. The man most responsible for modern socialism is this guy named Karl Marx, who call him the father of communism. As a student at the University of Berlin, he really began to embrace Darwinism and socialism. He believed that the cause of all past conflicts, that every single issue in history was because of a class struggle between the wealthy and the poor. He blamed private property as the cause of conflict, and that there would be no issues if there was no wealthy and there was no poor. He predicted that the working class would eventually rise up and overthrow the government. The middle class, it was just this big idea that all of these issues, there's no need to go into all of this, is not a philosophy class, but that if you could do away with class and that all men were equal in all ways, that there would be no more issues. And so he has this idea of a stateless, which means no division amongst anything. Just stateless, classless, a perfect condition. It was beyond socialism. It was a step further. Communism is a form of socialism which requires, here's the problem with communists. You take socialism and you take a step further. But the thing is, it requires this violent, bloody revolution in order to set up this totalitarian dictatorship, that one person is in absolute total control of everything, and that dictatorship dominates the personality and the property of its citizens. But the way that they get to that complete control is through physical and psychological terror, that they control every ounce of your life. You don't get to choose the job that you go to work at. You don't get to choose the doctor that you go to. You don't get to choose the school that you go to. And if you guys were at PCAL and have read The Giver, that's probably a bit of it probably isn't really a dramatic picture, but that is what total communism is. That would be taken to the total extreme, that a communist state, the government, the dictator, has dominated everything. And the problem is, not the problem, there's lots of problems with communism, but the scary part of it, beyond socialism, is the means that they get control. Where socialists use legislation, that should actually be a comma, that says comma on all of those. They use legislation, they use regulation, they use taxation to control. They put into place laws, they put into place taxes, they put into place fines, they put into place legal things to control. Communists gain control through a violent revolution. And while that sounds dramatic, all you have to do is open a history book. All you have to do is turn on the news and look at a place like Venezuela, look at a place like Korea, look at a place like Cuba, and you're going to see that that's exactly how they have found and gained their power. So we have these mindsets changing and these philosophies coming out. Political tensions are rising in Europe. The United States tries to alleviate the tensions, just like we've been doing throughout history up until this point, trying to promote peace. And we end up having 2 international peace conferences in the Netherlands. It's called The Hague. The first conference was held in 1899, and that conference was called by the Tsar of Russia, trying to keep peace. The second was called in 1907, and the Tsar of Russia and President Theodore Roosevelt kind of consecutively at the same time called for this second meeting. And at these conferences, the nations that were represented signed agreements allowing neutral nations to act as arbitrators in international disputes. So basically, they signed this agreement that if there is an internal conflict between 2 countries, that they would, instead of just declaring war on each other, that they would allow somebody else who was neutral, who had no ties to either side, to come in and act as a mediator and an arbitrator to hold the peace as long as possible. And Andrew Carnegie, who we had talked about before, being super wealthy, he helped build a building for this meeting place. Throughout President Roosevelt, throughout Taft, and throughout Wilson's presidencies, they were actively, and we've already talked a little bit about this, promoting peace worldwide. Soothing things over. There was a guy named William Jennings Bryan who also became very well known for his work in settling international disputes. He actually was able to, just during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, Bryan was able to successfully negotiate 31 different peace treaties during this time period. Things are just getting very, very ugly in Europe, and we are doing our best, along with other neutral nations, to try to keep the peace, because I think the whole world kind of understood if one country declares war on another country, it was going to become very, very ugly because of all of the alliances and all of these kinds of things. Despite the efforts by the American government, however, Europe had already sort of set foot on this uncontrollable course towards war. There was kind of too many things that already happened. Let's talk about some of the major causes of conflict. You have this extreme fanatical nationalism rising, and here's the thing: nationalism is this idea of being committed to your nation, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is it becomes so extreme that you typically start taking steps that are maybe not moral, or that are not healthy, or that are not good, in order to promote your nation above everything else. And one of those things that began to happen from this extreme nationalism is that many European powers or nations began to try to annex those areas that were being lived in by people of their own nationality. For example, there was a specific land that was between France and Germany. Germany had taken control of that land in 1871, and there were many minority people, like the Czechs in Austria-Hungary, who began to seek political independence, and it began to be this very ugly thing, and people are, well, you don't belong to this country, so you have to leave, and it just became this kind of ugly thing, which ultimately I think is the first step towards what we're going to see in World War II, with Hitler trying to create the perfect Aryan race, and that your nation and keeping your nation completely pure takes over everything. At the same time, you have this guy named Kaiser Wilhelm II. Germany becomes the most aggressively, militarily building nations. Germany, 1871, Germany had become a united nation. Kaiser Wilhelm II became this very forceful leader. Germany was really eager to sort of flex its muscles, to expand its territory, and to demonstrate the strength to some of these older nations of Europe. They really wanted to show their dominance. And so most of the German people had by this time rejected a whole lot, and that may be dramatic, but they had sort of turned their backs on, as a nation probably, their Christian heritage. They had really begun to leave. There was this vacuum kind of left. We had sort of already talked about that with all of these false teachings, and that the devaluing of human life, and it really began to affect how their country is being run. Kaiser Wilhelm II was kind of this violent first step towards laying the red carpet out for someone like Adolf Hitler. So then we have these alliances coming in, and here's the reality of how world wars start. You have alliances, which means you have groups of people who have made a treaty with each other that if somebody goes after country A, country B is their ally, and that means country B is going to come to their defense. Well, you have country C over here who is in alliance with country D, and if A declares war on D, then C is going to come to their defense, and before long you have a huge world war, because all of these countries have sort of formed teams. They formed alliances, and the beginning alliances that are beginning to form are the Triple Alliance, which were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Then you have the Triple Entity, which is Great Britain, France, and Russia. Now these are going to change slightly as we actually hit World War I, but these are the groups that are beginning to form alliances. Germany understands that if they declare war on Great Britain, that France and Russia are going to then come after them. Great Britain understands if Austria-Hungary is attacked, that Germany is, and it just becomes a big kind of scary thing because there were so many very powerful countries who are building alliances with each other. And then the real big kind of almost last kicker was this rivalry of land in what's called the Balkans. This is called the Balkan Peninsula. It's part of Turkey, and basically this little area of land, all the major European powers had conflicting interests here. Russia had a desire to control all of these Slavic nations. They were conflicting with their expansion into interests of Germany and Austria. France wanted to preserve its economic interests. England wanted to keep rival powers away from their area. So you have all of these. Turkey even they were wanting to protect their position in Europe, and the Balkan nations themselves are wanting to remain independent. And so you have all of these people fighting over this one little section of land, and that really becomes a tipping point between all of these countries. All right, we have this guy named Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He's heir to the Austrian throne. He and his wife were shot by a Serbian assassin in the town of Sarajevo. Many Austrians believe that anti-Austrian propaganda coming out of Serbia had instigated this assassination. Of course, then when your leader is assassinated, you take action, and many Austrian leaders decided it was time to sort of take aggressive action. And for 1 month, there was about a month period that diplomats are trying to prevent open conflict, but on July 28th, so 1 month, Austria declares war on Serbia. Again, that's not unusual, I don't think, when their leader is assassinated. And this was technically the official war, beginning of World War I. Now, we need to understand that at the time, there wasn't going to be, they didn't know there was going to be a World War II, so it wasn't known as World War I. It was known as the Great War. Okay, so when you read about the Great War, that's technically World War I. And then, of course, like so many knew would happen, all of Europe is soon involved. August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. August 3rd, Germany declares war on France. The thought by Germany, from what I can tell, is they believed that Russia was building up they were starting to mobilize their military, so Germany tried to get the upper hand and declare war first. Then they declared war on France. Then on August 14th, 1914, England declares war on Germany because, of course, England and France are allies. At the time, before the United States gets involved, we're neutral for a while, but ultimately we have two groups. We have the Central Powers and the Allies, and I want to take 1 second and talk about the Central Powers and the Allies because there's an interesting thing here. So with the Central Powers, you have Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And that's why Germany began to declare war, because they were allies with Austria-Hungary. And when Austria's leader was assassinated, then, of course, by a Serbian, they declare war on the enemy. But the Allies is what I find interesting. We ultimately become part of the Allies. We're not in this list yet because when the war broke out, we were neutral. We were trying to sort of let them take care of their own business. And we have Great Britain, France, Russia, Serbia, Belgium, Romania, Japan, Portugal, Montenegro, Greece, and Italy. And the interesting one there for me is Japan, because we fought with Japan in World War I. Russia is going to become an interesting country as we walk through World War I, but we're going to do that next week because we're already at like 25 minutes of this lecture, and I can't fit World War I in a short couple of minutes. So we're going to stop here and finish World War I next lecture. Don't forget about your homework. Your note paper needs to be turned in. You need to make sure you get your state's project or assignment completed. That was linked in the same place that this video was. And your online quiz done. All right, that's it.